takes to retain power.
Trump is an autocrat, and when an autocrat tells you what he is and what he's going to do, we should believe him. Good afternoon and welcome again to The Count, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. This is my co-host, Alana Sivan. So it is Monday, October 26th, and you know what that means? It means we are 8 days out from the end of voting. And you will notice that I am not calling it Election Day because the election has been happening already for quite some time. November 3rd is just the end of voting. If you've got a mail-in ballot you're sitting on at your house, now's the time to take it to the post box or to drop it off because we are a week and a day, folks, away from the end of voting. Now, this election has been very special. We are seeing astonishing quantities of turnout, more than 50 million ballots cast, which has already surpassed, of course, the early vote total for 2016, and is actually 40% already of the total votes cast in 2016. As we said on our last show, recent predictions suggest that we could hit 60% turnout this year, which would be the highest turnout has been in this country since the 26th Amendment was passed. Now, that is not a reason to get complacent. I'm giving you the good facts so that you can feel inspired, get out there, take your mom to vote, take your dad to vote, take your friends to vote, take your grandma to vote, everybody. Because this is not just a show about the election. This is a show about all of the different terrifying crisis point ways that the Trump campaign and allies could try to subvert the will of the people, could try to secure 4 more years of minority rule through a variety of tactics, all of which we've talked about on this show, which has existed as sort of an unfolding and very informative, harrowing series of episodes.
You know, Emily, it seems that the closer we get towards Election Day, there are just more nightmare scenarios that keep making their way into my head that I can't stop thinking about. And luckily, we have this show where we don't just have to think about them in our head, but we can talk about them, confront them, and talk about how we'll deal with them this year. And so if you've watched this show before, we've talked a lot about the 2000 presidential election and the legal battle that ensued then, which eventually ended when Al Gore conceded after the Supreme Court ruling in Bush v. Gore. But Bush v. Gore didn't have to be the end of the line for Al Gore. He could have kept fighting, but instead decided to do what was decent and expected of him according to political norms. And all of that has made us wonder, could this year turn out similarly? Well, today we don't just have to wonder. We are thrilled to be joined by a guest who had a front row seat to the action in 2000. Donnie Fowler was Al Gore's national field director during the 2000 presidential campaign, a veteran of 6 more presidential campaigns, including those of Bill Clinton, John Kerry, Barack Obama, and is currently a senior advisor for Jamie Harrison's U.S. Senate campaign. Donnie, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hello, glad to be here.
All right, so last week on our show, we forced our viewers to sit through a clip from election night 2000, which had Dan Rather calling the election for George W. Bush just hours after the networks had initially projected a victory for Gore in Florida. And we will not make you sit through that video. We did not like sitting through that video. We don't want to sit through that video again. But
God bless you.
Yeah, no. But we'd love to torture you in a different way, actually, and ask you to take us through your recollection of those hours on election night inside the Gore campaign and how they shaped the eventual decision to contest the election results.
Well, it was 20 years ago, but it feels very, very close still. Thanks for having me. We were in the national headquarters was in Nashville, Tennessee, where Al Gore was a senator and a congressman, and where his father was a U.S. senator before that, one of the only Southern U.S. senators to vote against the Vietnam War, in fact. So our national headquarters in 1999 and 2000 was in an old call center in the Nashville suburbs. So we had a big open floor with some offices ringing around the edge of it. And on election day, we had a nerve center we called the boiler room. And that's where we had about 20 people, all of whom were attached to a phone. And those phones were all linked to battleground states around the country. And Florida, of course, like today, was a major battleground state. And we were getting reports even before the polls opened in Florida and elsewhere about what was happening on the ground. Early that morning, election morning 2000, we got a call from the state director in Florida, Nick Baldick, who said, there's something funny. We're getting funny reports from Palm Beach County about the way the ballots look. The ballots seem to be confusing some of the voters. Over the course of the day, those reports got stronger. And then we get to the time when the polls close, and we're hearing other problems in other counties in Florida. As you said, Dan Rather and the other hosts on broadcast TV and cable TV were calling the election and having their own views of what was happening around the country. Suddenly, the Florida was called for Bush, then it was called uncalled for Bush. And we were all up and down, as you can imagine, emotionally. Al Gore was across town, downtown Nashville, where the post-election or election night rally was happening. And we in the boiler room were looking at statistics that said, we don't know what these cable and broadcast TV stations are looking at. What we're seeing is that we don't know who's going to win Florida. But Gore wasn't hearing that message, and he was backstage about to walk outside in some light rain to make a concession to George W. Bush. And all of a sudden, we heard that was happening. And Michael Hooley, who was our leader in the boiler room, said, get Mike Feldman on the call. Mike Feldman was Al Gore's body guy. He was the guy that traveled with Al everywhere. Gore was literally about to walk on the stage and concede defeat about 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock that night, election night, 2000. And at the very last minute, Michael Hooley talked to Mike Feldman and said, pull him back, do not let him concede. And they said, well, the networks are calling it. And the boiler room said, we have better information than the media has, pull him back. Fast forward a few more hours and we still don't know. It's midnight, it's 1 o'clock in the morning, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. We're all still trying to figure out what's happening. As a national field director, I got tasked with finding the team that was going to go to Florida at sunrise the next morning. So at 2 o'clock a.m., we had found Joe Lieberman's plane. It had Gore Lieberman broadly painted across the fuselage. And I was sitting there trying to figure out what 74 people were going to go get on that airplane at dawn and fly to Florida. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know very much at all. What we did know, which is one of the top lawyers in the country on recounts told us, was no recount lasts more than 2 or 3 days. So once I found the 74 people to get on the plane, I called them in and I stood on a desk in the middle of this big call center. And I said, if I call your name, I want you to go home to your apartment, or if you're here from out of town, to your hotel. I want you to pack a bag for 2 or 3 days. No recount has ever lasted more than 2 or 3 days. And the people who didn't get called were very disappointed. I had some people that were crying because everybody wanted to be a part of the solution. So we ended up going to the airport, getting on Joe Lieberman's airplane and flying to Florida at dawn that next morning.
Okay, so I have so many follow-ups from this, and I'm also like wondering why there hasn't been the movie of this night yet, because it's very like, I'm picturing like the movie Independence Day, where like after the alien invasion, there's the president standing up on the desk making the St. Crispin's Day speech. Anyway, it's interesting to me to think about the mindset that Al Gore must have had, to be backstage preparing himself to go on stage and concede the election. To be called a loser by like every major news network, to be, essentially taking a position that Alana and I as public defenders are very familiar with, which is everybody's telling you you're wrong and you are going to have to dust yourself off and fight anyway. To what extent do you think that positionality like impacted the way the fight took place thereafter, and how?
So much of the 2000 recount was psychological. And what we were immediately behind the 8 ball because the state had been called for Bush and then uncalled for Bush. It had never been called for Gore, if I remember correctly. So we start out with the psychology that, well, Bush has some advantage. and that was with the media, with the voters, and even to some degree with ourselves. We felt like we were always looking uphill, fighting uphill. But we went down there as warriors. We went down there as grassroots organizers. We went down there as event planners. We went down there as press operatives with the intent. We had one job, and that was find out what happened. And so we had somebody in every county, not just Palm Beach County. We had somebody in every county in the state of Florida before lunchtime the day after the election. And their task was very neutral, in fact. We weren't there to be advocates. We were there to just get the record straight. What happened in your county? Was there anything that was unusual? So I would say that we started off in the public narrative a little bit behind. We started off feeling like we dodged a bullet when we pulled Al Gore off the stage before he was going to concede. But when we got to Florida, we felt like we have a mission and we have a job, and we're going to go try to find out what happened, and then we're going to fight for a victory.
Do you think that I mean, like the sort of like acceptance of death and then having this Lazarus moment, do you think that impacted Gore's decisions later on how far he was willing to go before sort of yielding to the preservation of the norms and decorum and sort of, I guess, good sportsmanship of national politics?
No, I don't think so. Al Gore, whatever you know of his public persona, Al Gore is a fighter, and Al Gore is stubborn, and Al Gore is smart and committed, and he wanted to be president, and he thought he should be president. So I don't think that in the early stages that psychology in the public narrative on election night really impacted what was happening strategically and tactically in Florida. How were we going to conduct the recount? Were we going to be political? Were we going to counter protest when all the Republicans from Capitol Hill in their Brooks Brothers suits flew in and started protesting and stopped recounts in some places like Miami? Our view, I believe that he didn't have a feeling that he was behind. I think we were making tactical and strategic decisions based on what we thought was best to try to get the election in our favor.
I'm glad you mentioned the protests in Miami against the recount, because I'm thinking about sort of the long history within the GOP playbook of preventing votes from being counted. And this happens sort of at multiple stages. During election time when people are voting and sort of actions aimed at voter suppression, and then once votes are cast and preventing them from being counted. Could you talk a little bit more about how that came into play during the 2000 election and perhaps how you might see it happening now?
In 2000, the most famous error in Florida during election day was in Palm Beach County, where Trump has his Mar-a-Lago, estate. And it was what was called a butterfly ballot. And what happened was you punch a hole in the ballot. It's a card, like a little piece of cardboard. You punch a hole in it next to the name of the presidential candidate or any other candidate you wanted to support. And the way they printed this ballot was, it was a little confusing because there was a punch hole that looked like it was next to Gore and Lieberman, but in fact belonged to Pat Buchanan, who was the Donald Trump of the day. He was a right-winger, third-party candidate. And so we didn't actually, when voters got confused about punching, is that the Gore punch hole or is that the Buchanan punch hole? It wasn't that when voters made a mistake in Palm Beach County, the votes went to Bush. The votes actually went to this third-party right-wing populist. And we made a few decisions then that I think were important in determining the psychology of the recount and the outcome of the recount. We decided that we weren't going to protest. We decided that we were going to do this recount properly, legally, in the courts if we needed to, but certainly by trying to have a fair and open recount in some counties. Now that might have been mistake number one, which is we didn't ask for recount for every county. We asked for recount only in some counties in the state. The second thing that put us behind was our decision not to protest when the Republicans were very clear and very aggressive about protesting. And it wasn't, at the time, they played it as grassroots Floridians rising up against the injustice of George W. Bush losing the election in his brother's state. Jeb Bush was the governor of Florida at the time. And so we started losing the sort of visual narrative with the American people because it looked like the Bush people were most passionate. It looked like they cared more. And it made us look a little bit like we were nerds trying to, make legal arguments about winning the election. So many of us were really frustrated. We were sitting, as I said, we had been all over this. We were in every county in the state with operatives a few days before the Republicans even woke up and realized what was happening. But we weren't really permitted. We were told not to counter protest. We were told not to create demonstrations or even press conferences for that matter. We were going to handle it properly and appropriately. I think that in the narrative, public narrative, that put us behind a little. I think at the end of the day, 36 days later, not 2 to 3 days later, as they told us when we left Nashville, 36 days later, when the end came, Gore really had the same attitude, which at the end was proper, right? We're going to do, American democracy depends on a peaceful transition of power. At the beginning, I think this decision not to be political or work in the press hurt us a little bit. So it was a mixed bag. It was a mixed bag at the end of the day, how we started and what the Republicans did publicly and what we chose not to do publicly.
Do you see any of that same dynamic playing itself out now, both
Yes.
sort of before elections? And if you could elaborate a little bit on how you're seeing that.
So I'll take the Republican side and then I'll take what the Democrats do. The conservatives in this country have almost always in history been the ones who want to make it harder for American citizens to vote, or want to make it harder for people who can't vote, women, African Americans, to get the right to vote. Now, sometimes those conservatives are in the Democratic Party, sometimes in the Republican Party, but it is very consistently historically that conservatives want to make it harder to participate in our democracy, and liberals, progressives are the ones fighting for a greater franchise. This took particular attention. It became acute in 1965 when Lyndon B. Johnson, prompted by Dr. King, signed the Voting Rights Act. And the conservatives, again, in the South at the time it was Democrats, but they were the conservatives. The conservatives immediately said, wait a minute, we can't have African Americans vote. It'll take away our power, our political power, our economic power, our cultural power. And they quickly came up with ways that were marginally legal to slow down the vote. They could no longer charge somebody a $5 tax if they wanted to vote. They could no longer ask somebody to read a clause of the US Constitution and then the white election judge decided whether that was a proper understanding of the Constitution. Starting in 1965, you couldn't do those overt denials. So every election, every year, all year, conservatives now, which are now the Republicans, work to make they work to write the rules so that their suppression is legal. That's very important. They work to write rules and laws so that suppression is legal. And they work to perfect intimidation of voters and miseducation of voters. So there's really two parts of the suppression puzzle. One is spending time between elections rewriting rules. For example, this push a few years ago to require every voter to have an ID at the polls. Otherwise, you can't vote. In Texas, they even wrote the rules so tightly that you can have your hunting license as a proper ID, but if you're a student at a university, you can't use your student ID, right? So when the Republicans say that they're not doing anything illegal, it tends to be true because they've written the laws that make it harder to vote. Now, what are the second bucket? And that is intimidation. I've worked in 17 states around the country over the years, including running 3 presidential battleground states or leading 3 presidential battleground states to victory. for Bill Clinton, for John Kerry, and for Barack Obama. And the intimidation, the side tactics that Republicans use vary from telling voters that if that the election's on Wednesday this year, not Tuesday, just confusing them. It has included, for example, telling poor voters or voters of color that, if you go to the polls and there's anything wrong at all with your voter record or your ID, you could face criminal charges. Just straight out intimidation and fear. And I've also seen sometimes very well-meaning Republican volunteers go to Democratic precincts. They don't go to their own precincts to make sure there's not fraud happening. They only go to Democratic precincts. So it's often a white fraternity boy or a well-meaning white lady from the suburbs going into a city like Detroit, where it's 90% has been 90%, 80% African American, and trying to challenge the ballots. Well, do you really live at that address, voter? Is your ID, the name on your ID, exactly the same as the name on your voter record? And the Republican operatives and professionals in leadership are very cynical, and they know that what they're doing is suppressing the vote. They understand that their job is to slow down Democratic voting or to cancel it out altogether. The real trick for Democrats is that often the volunteers at the polling place have a sincere belief that there's fraud, have a sincere belief that Democratic voters, poor people, brown people, black people, are voting twice. It doesn't happen. It's not true. I always say that if the Democratic Party was committing voter fraud in the elections, I would have been the one doing it, because I've been the field organizer and the grassroots manager, right? And I've never done it, and I've never heard anybody talk about it. But there's a real belief by some of these Republican volunteers, sincere, unfortunately, that they're doing good by democracy. So this suppression, this intimidation takes many forms: legal rules, misinformation, well-meaning people who are misinformed that challenge ballots and slow voting down, so the lines get longer and longer and longer and voters turn away. And so it's a multifaceted, multi-front attack on voting.
It's so funny because you have tapped into so many of the themes that we've been talking about on the show. One being Republicans utilizing existing bureaucracy and utilizing sort of like picky, meaningless little laws to weaponize them and to use that to suppress the vote. We've talked about how when more people vote, Democrats win. So the voter suppression machine is really on the Republican side. We've talked about fraud not being a thing. And we've also talked quite a bit about the reliance, the voters who are still Trump voters at this point are so reliant on not even really Fox News, on Donald Trump for their information. Yeah. They are receiving like this single source flow of misinformation that causes them to be essentially living in a parallel reality from the rest of us. So now that you've hit on almost all of the major themes of this show, I'm going to hit on the last remaining major theme of the show, which is the Supreme Court, which is obviously like the next chapter in this story. So it feels highly relevant right now to a bunch of the different like nightmare scenarios that we could be facing. And we've talked on the show about the impact of that decision on today's court, even though that decision specifically disavows any applicability beyond itself. But still, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about within the campaign, what was the reaction to that ruling at the time, and how did it ultimately factor into the decision to concede?
Well, in 2000, during that Florida recount, every day was an emotional roller coaster. Most of the work we did legally was in Florida state courts. And then if an issue wasn't resolved, it would move up to a federal court. There were days literally when we woke up in the morning and we got a bad court decision and we were depressed. By lunchtime, we would get a good court decision and we felt revived. And by the time dinner came around, we had another bad court decision. And so the roller coaster was excessively fast and bumpy. so when Bush v. Gore got to the Supreme Court itself, the U.S. Supreme Court, not the Florida Supreme Court, I felt like, well, there's just another court hearing. Maybe this is the last one, maybe not, but there's just another court hearing, and we'll have to, they'll tell us, Al and the legal team will tell us whether we're going to continue to fight.
So,
And
sorry, just to quickly follow up on that. How were you getting the information? I mean, how was that filtering through to the bigger group? Like the legal team was giving you guys play by play. Like what was going on with that? It was a
surreal combination of hearing directly from the legal team and seeing news break on cable TV.
Okay.
Because sometimes the cable TV stations like CNN would hear of a court ruling before, at the same time as our lawyers. And so by the time our lawyers got on the phone to call us, we'd already seen it on CNN.
Got it.
So it was a real mixed bag of how we were getting that information out in all the counties around the state, even in Tallahassee, where the state headquarters was, because a lot of the lawyers were working in Washington, D.C., obviously for the Supreme Court itself. So when we got word, maybe, it was 20 years ago, but it was only 2 or 3 or 4 hours before Gore actually gave the concession speech on television that we knew that was going to happen. There was no decision the day before that I'm aware of. It was, hey, we have another court case. We lost that one. We get another one. And we had 3 or 4 hours notice. And there was no plan. There was no campaign event. There was no celebration or a funeral like you have in all campaigns on election day. We were scattered around the state. There were a couple of hundred of us. And we just went to a bar, or I was in a pool hall, right, with 5 or 6 of my fellow campaign staff. And it was the middle of the afternoon on a weekday, and we asked the people that ran the bar, pool hall, to turn up the TV. And we sat there with beers in our hand and watched Gore give that speech. And it was a serious speech. It was a sober speech. It was a speech with gravitas. And while we were very mixed going into that speech, the Gore staff, we were very mixed about whether we wanted to concede or not, fight on. I would say that by the time Al gave his speech, finally conceding, we all felt, that's leadership. That's what leadership does. And while we weren't happy, almost all of us were willing to accept that the end of the road had come.
So I'm just wondering, like, the Supreme Court at that time may have been tacitly political, but the Supreme Court we have now is like nakedly political. I mean, there's very little ability to argue that the Supreme Court, as it is currently composed or as it's going to be composed by the end of this week, is anything short of, it is no longer the adult in the room. And back in 2000, the Supreme Court was still kind of the adult in the room, as opposed to like the Brett Kavanaugh in the frat house. Forgive me.
Hey, it's the truth.
It is. It's the truth. I mean, it's at this point, they're just like more politicians. And so I'm wondering how much, if you know, that aspect of the court having such authority pushed the decision to concede, or whether the decision to concede was made separately from the authority given to the court at that time.
Well, we just didn't have any choice. We really had nowhere else to go. Once the U.S. Supreme Court speaks, you don't get an appeal. I mean, they are the final decider. And there just wasn't anywhere else for us to go once the U.S. court stopped the recount. So what was Al Gore supposed to do? Was he supposed to raise an army? Was he supposed to raise a bunch of militias? Knock 2020. Where else could he have gone? What else could he have done? There truly was no option short of raising troops and fighting it out, because all the civil and legal, political science avenues had come to an end. And why I said it was leadership is because Gore recognized that, and as much as it destroyed him, he grew. If you remember, he grew a long beard and.
I remember the beard.
Really fat. Yeah. The year after,
it's the beard all men grow when they're wounded. I've seen
many
men.
David Letterman still has his.
Kind of like a quarantine beard a little bit.
Yes, a quarantine. Good, thank you. I had one of those 6 months ago.
So wait, let me just twist this question one last way, that just to make it even harder. knowing what we know now about the court, about the dramatic differences between 2000 and now, if Joe Biden were to be facing a similarly negative court decision, but on, a court as it is presently and imminently composed, what would your message to him be? Would you be thinking that the decision he should make would be different in terms of how to fight back, or whether to fight back, or whether to concede, or do you think he should do the same thing?
Man, that's just such a difficult question. let me
I know.
cheat. Let me cheat here. I think it's very, 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 very unlikely that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have a say in the final result of this presidential election. Now, because the main reason is that in the United States, almost all election laws and election rules are handled at the state level. There's very, very little that the federal government does around elections. There's very little that the U.S. Supreme Court has said about elections, other than you can't discriminate based on race or gender, and every person, one vote. I mean, the federal government has, generally speaking, stayed out of elections. And so the truth is that the debate, the advice that I might give to Joe Biden, if he cared to ask, would probably be advice about how far to take it in any particular state court. Michigan, North Carolina, Florida, Nevada, Arizona. So that's sort of, I'm sort of avoiding your question. So let me try to answer it. And I think it's the same way that Al Gore answered it. Was I supposed to raise an army? I mean, what would you tell Joe Biden as an American in good conscience to go raise an army and start a civil war? That's a tough question, and I don't know what I would say in the moment. I don't. But I don't think we're going to be at that point. I honestly don't. Even if it's a super close election and we don't know, as we don't expect to know for a few days. Somebody said counting votes is not a crisis. Counting votes is not a crisis. And no matter what Donald Trump says, where he's going to claim victory on election day, and then he's going to start accusing everybody of fraud. Well, that is, into some ways, if you want to compare this year to 2000 and the Florida recount, and the fact that the Gore campaign decided not to participate aggressively in the public messaging, not to participate aggressively in protesting. That's something that the Biden campaign should be prepared to do. And frankly, I think they are prepared to do. Counting votes is not a crisis. The election's not over just because Donald Trump says it's over. The election's over when all the votes are counted. That's how we do it in the United States. So I think that's the message you're already hearing from the Democrats in the Biden campaign. I think that's the message you're going to continue hearing. The other thing is, you fight until that day when there is literally no other legal recourse. You protest, you demonstrate, not violently, despite what the Republicans say about our burning cities. I'll tell you today, San Francisco is a perfect 72 degrees and there's no fires. You fight, you protest, you struggle, you exhaust every avenue. You don't give up until there is literally no other option. And that's probably at noon on the day of inauguration.
So something that we've discussed a little bit on this show is sort of this doomsday scenario that could happen where Donald Trump does sort of everything within his power to make sure mail-in ballots aren't counted.
Right.
And then it's a few days after, or the safe harbor date comes up, December 8th, and we still don't have those ballots counted. And then Trump calls, the GOP legislatures in certain states decide that they've won that election without counting all of these other ballots. Something we've discussed on this show as a potential for Democrats to do in that sort of scenario where there are so many mail-in ballots that haven't been counted is for Democrats in that state to send a different slate of competing electors. Is that something that was ever brought up in 2000? And do you think it's something that should be considered in this election to come, if it comes to that?
I don't believe the Gore campaign in 2000 ever got to that contingency. there was a push. we had done the research in the national headquarters. Are there electors that might leave and vote independently of whoever their state votes for? And we had identified a few electors around the country that might not go for George Bush, but we planned for it, but we never, as far as I know, there was never any serious conversation. What I can say for certain is that the Biden campaign, the Democratic National Committee, all the other allied groups have planned for all these contingencies, have sort of war gamed this out in all different scenarios. I have an abiding belief that if it comes down to the legislatures, Alana, that the Republicans in the states, not the Republicans in Congress, but the Republicans in the states and the governors who have been much more willing to buck and be independent of Donald Trump, I think that they will not try to cheat their way through the result of the election. I think that even the Republican governors, most of them, and the Republican legislatures, most of them, are going to try to do things the right way. And that is a great contrast, a significant contrast to the behavior we see from the Republicans in Washington, D.C., whether it's the senators and House members or whether it's the professional political operatives. So, I just have more confidence in leadership at the state level because they can't afford to be that partisan at the end of the day. And on the other hand, American people don't want that kind of nasty cheating. And Republicans, just like Democrats, like to get reelected. I think there's a break on that sort of extreme scenario that you described, where there's state legislatures try to do something untoward. There's also, of course, the scenario where it goes to the U.S. House of Representatives. And then there's also the scenario where we don't actually have a conclusion at noon on inaugural day and Nancy Pelosi becomes the president. Republicans don't want that. So seems to me they want to conclude the business of the presidential election before noon on inauguration day. These hypotheticals are scary to think about.
That's literally
and you have
of the show. So yes,
yeah, you have to plan for them. And I would say that I think the Democrats have learned a lot of lessons from 2000 from the Gore campaign. One of them is planning for these contingency scenarios, because it just seems so crazy and so impossible in 2000 that something like this would happen. It just seemed out of the realm of imagination, much less reality. And I don't think Democrats and progressives have that illusion anymore. So we're much better prepared for all the possible contingencies. We're much better prepared for the mundane things. If there are ballots that have mistakes on them, like a voter didn't sign his or her ballot, how do we go fix that? How do we cure that in the parlance of voting? How do we cure that ballot? And we have ways we're fighting to cure ballots in every state now before the election, and we have ways to find broken ballots and cure them after the election too. So we're much better prepared for all these possible tricks.
So I think I have to do our viewers the kindness of letting us wrap on that mildly hopeful point, which is
you're way more optimistic than we are, but it's so good to hear.
It's good to be told by someone working in the field that they are optimistic and that they have a belief in the bona fides, or at least marginally improved bona fides, of local legislators. Yeah. And I hope very much that you are either right or irrelevant, because if we have some kind of election day landslide for Joe Biden, we don't even have to have these conversations anymore. And wouldn't that be a boon? We could all just put our feet up, take a load off, and stop fretting all the time. Anyway, Donnie Fowler, it has been such a pleasure having you on the show. It has been fascinating. We all wish you the best of luck with your work in South Carolina. Thank you so much for joining.
I enjoyed it, Alana and Emily. Thank you for inviting me.
We hope
Thank you.
Take care. Man, I have to say, like, I can't believe that, like, the sort of seminal movie about that night about that moment in American history hasn't been made. Maybe it has been made and I didn't see it. But
I know I got chills just hearing about the standing on the table and everybody sort of waiting to see who gets to go on the plane. And
I'm picturing like candy bar Nokia phones ringing in the night and getting the news, from the TV in a bar. Like,
yeah.
so many good pre-pandemic memories of a world gone. But I think it's really interesting to think about. In 2000, it's funny how well I remember this election. It was 20 years ago. I don't actually think I was old enough to vote. I can't totally remember if I was like over the line. I'd have to do math in my head, which I'm not going to do in front of all of these people. But I still remember it so intimately. And obviously the years that followed, one remembers irrevocably. We had no idea in 2000 what would follow. I mean, 9/11, endless war, massive loss of life. Yet here we are standing at a moment in 2020 where like, we can't really make the same argument that we don't know what we're getting into if this election goes sideways. Like in 2000, Al Gore standing up there conceding did not know what would happen next.
Right.
But we now, I mean, obviously one cannot predict the scale of cartoon evil that could befall us because they got new cartoon evil coming out every day. But it is really interesting to think about the difference, the way the stakes are perceived differently and the way norms are adhered to differently when you really, really know what a loss for Joe Biden means.
And also, I will just interject here for a quick second to say that apparently there was a movie. It was called Recount. It was on HBO. But back then, HBO didn't have sort of not everybody had HBO. And if they did, it wasn't if they didn't, it wasn't in the culture the same way HBO is today. So Recount, look at that. Right? And so, but yeah, you're absolutely right, Emily, that the stakes this time, everybody knows how high they are. And the Democrats particularly know how high they are. So I think it will be a real test because I think, when we spoke with Donnie, and this was really nice to hear him talk about, he talked about how that was a moment of real leadership for Al Gore. He thinks it was the right decision. And he also you saw him, at least I saw him sort of swell up with pride when talking about him making that decision and watching him during that concession speech. And I think that's because, A, just like you were saying, we didn't know how bad it would be. And B, there is value to having a government that isn't in chaos. And so he sort of saw himself as the person who was going to end chaos. And I think if we reach a similar situation now, the person, Joe Biden conceding, will not be an end to chaos.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, we have nothing to lose on the chaos front. We are living in chaos. It's certainly not going to make things more chaotic for Joe Biden to fight extra hard. It's also like the degree to which, I mean, we are fighting right now against historic voter suppression, subversion. I mean, like tactics that are really, really aggressive. I mean, look at what's happening with Amy Coney Barrett right now. Like 8 days before an election, Republicans are, in the absence of any Democratic or any bipartisan support, ramming through a justice like in the 11th hour, which is the last few years have been these years of tactics that would have been shocking to all of us 10 years ago. And if those tactics are allowed to stand and to have worked and to have secured indefinite power for the people who use them, I mean, we have no more levers of power to pull. Like all of the bad stuff will have worked. It puts me back in like toddler mom brain. It's like the toddler has done everything wrong and we are about to reward that if we let the toddler continue doing everything wrong, which in this context is of course bone chilling. But it's no more chaos to add from the Biden side.
But I think what also was nice to hear, and again, I think we've sort of taken a different perspective on this show, but it was still really nice to hear this, was how Donnie thinks that GOP legislatures and governors will have had enough and will say no to chaos. And that puts me in a place of hope, because I think there probably are a lot of GOP voters or Republican voters who don't like chaos. Who like a government that is decent. and hopefully will be rising up if their GOP legislatures don't do what they're supposed to do and if they give in to cheating. And that gives me a little bit of hope. And hopefully that's something, and it all comes back to what we've said on this show, is that it's really about, are you for democracy or are you against it? Or are you okay with subverting it?
There's a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who want to get off this ride.
Right. And it's funny, he talked about conservatives, and he used the word conservative instead of saying Republicans and Democrats a lot of times, which I thought was really interesting because he talked about conservatives on both sides of the aisle. And so that's an interesting way of framing it in terms of people who are okay, again, with subverting democracy and those who are not.
It's also really helpful when talking about history, because there's that moment at which the parties kind of ideologically did a switcheroo.
Exactly. But let's go even further down history, not further, actually pretty close in history to a place that none of us like to talk about. But unfortunately, for our next segment, we have to talk about it. And that is 2016. I'm sorry, we have to do it.
I don't like it.
I know, none of us like it. But truthfully, we're already seeing some similarities between 2016 and now. So we have to talk about them, because the uncomfortable truth is that around this time in 2016, polls were showing that Trump was trailing by significant margins, both nationally and in key battleground states, including states that he would ultimately win. And pollsters pretty much universally predicted that Clinton would cruise to victory. So let's take a look at these.
Times like 90% chance. I hated that thing.
Let's look. Well, you're going to have to see them again. Sorry. So let's pull that up.
All right.
So here's this 538 poll showing that Hillary Clinton had a 71.4% chance of winning with, look at that, over 302 electoral votes. Let's go to the next one. And look at this. We're seeing and this is from Fox News, by the way, a prediction showing 274 electoral votes for Clinton and 215 for Trump. All right, we have one more.
That's the one I hate the most. There it is.
85% chance to win. All right, get out of here. I remember looking at all these polls and thinking there's no way. I mean, we definitely are going to have a winner, but I think at the end of the day, we know that.
I'm clearly having flashbacks. I'm like, I'm not even holding up my end of the conversation. I'm just like lost in flashback world.
Take a moment. We got to breathe this.
No, I think the reason one has flashbacks is because we are still in a world where polls are coming out every day and we're hearing about them, and we're in a state where Joe Biden is showing a strong lead. He's up by a substantial margin nationally and in key battleground states, and according to the polls, Donald Trump is losing this election. But considering the history, we've been told that before. We have touched this hot burner before, and we remember the pain of it. So I think you really can't blame people for either taking these polls with a huge grain of salt or like not really listening to them at all, or having any level of doubts in between. So I think the question we want to tackle is, are we headed for another shocking round of upsets and another year of reflection about how all the polls got it so wrong? Or has something changed? Has the tech improved? Is this widget better than the last widget? Have we learned from 2016? So of course, who do we ask in poll time?
Poll time.
Jason Gans with us again today from Data for Progress. Except instead of talking about specific polling results today, we're going to force him to explain his entire industry and justify what we are being told today. Jason, thank you so much for engaging in this exercise with us.
Absolutely. Great to be back.
Okay, Jason, so you are the expert on polls and in the poll and data business for a while now. And so I guess the thing that we have to ask is, what went so wrong in 2016? And maybe in talking about that, you can sort of talk to us about, what does a good poll look like? How do you get an accurate poll? And why didn't they get one in 2016? And how can we make sure that doesn't happen again in 2020?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's not going to surprise you. It is one that folks within the polling industry have been spending a lot of time thinking about since 2016. So before we go into what makes a good poll and specifically why the polls in 2016 were off, I want to kind of do a little benchmarking about where we are now compared to where we were 4 years ago, and just to show that again, nothing is ever for certain, but one thing that we do know is that right now things look different than they did in 2016. So going into 2016, we saw on that Nate Silver map that Hillary Clinton was projected to win by about 3.5 to 4 percentage points nationally. She ended up winning about 2.5 points nationally. And what that meant was that even though she won the popular vote, there were a couple of the key states in the Midwest, the quote unquote blue wall states that ended up going for Trump. So there was a national polling average of around 1 to 2 points. Joe Biden is winning in the polling averages by 9.4 points right now. So if we are to assume that something is to go wrong, it has to be not just what went wrong in 2016 goes wrong again in the same direction, but it actually has to be what went wrong in 2016 goes wrong again in the same direction, but substantially worse. A polling error of the 2016 size right now would actually still point towards a relatively comfortable Biden victory. So when we're looking at the polls, again, anything can happen. There's never 100% certainty with this, but a polling error of the 2016 size would actually still lead to a Joe Biden victory. So that being said, what did go wrong in 2016, particularly in the state level polls, particularly in those polls in the Midwest? So an important thing to recognize when you're looking at a poll is that no poll is ever, when it's fielded, getting a perfectly representative sample of voters, because it's just, you don't know exactly who you're going to get. So you go and you try and bring in a representative sample of voters, but then you take that poll and you weight it. So for example, if you're doing a poll and you are only calling landlines, what would happen is you would be having way too few young people in your poll because young people don't have landlines. So maybe you think that young people are going to make up 30 to 40% of the electorate, but you end up only getting 15% of young people in your poll. So then what you do is you weight the poll to make it representative of your likely voter electorate. So you say, okay, we're going to upweight those young people a little bit, and we're going to downweight the old people so that we can have a representative poll. And every poll, essentially every poll that you see out there from any sort of reputable pollster is almost always going to be weighted. And what you weight on really has an impact on how good the poll ends up being and what the poll ends up saying, because obviously that shows what you think the electorate's going to look like, who you're including in the poll. It's very, very impactful. And one thing that we saw, a trend that we've been seeing for many years, but something that got really accelerated in 2016, was that education became much more explanatory when deciding who someone was going to vote for, over race, over income, over gender. We found that beyond all of those things, college-educated people were much, much more likely to break Clinton, and non-college educated people were much, much more likely to vote Trump. And so what happened in the polls leading up to 2016 was that many of these state level polls weren't weighting on education, and they were having an electorate that was far too college educated. And since we know that college educated people are more likely to vote more likely to vote Clinton, then that was biasing the polls in Clinton's favor. So that was there were obviously many, many technical aspects that were worked on and corrected in the industry. But if we were to pick one overwhelming issue that caused a lot of the polls to miss in 2016, was not weighting on education.
Jason,
are there other factors?
quickly,
Absolutely.
I got to cut in with a question on this, because when Alana and I were talking to Donnie Fowler in the green room before the show, he said that one of the pieces of information he was most eager to hear more about is what was happening right now with non-college voters. What can you tell us what's happening right now? Like, what are your predictions? What's happening in terms of turnout, in terms of engagement, in terms of reliably still breaking for Trump? What do you know about those voters?
Yeah, so non-college voters and non-college whites are still going to be a demographic that's reliably voting for Trump, and they're going to be turning out in decent numbers. But what matters here is the margins, right? So what we're seeing is that there is a relatively substantial shift in the voting patterns of non-college whites, particularly in the Midwest, where I mean, this is just never going to be a good demographic for Democrats. We're not going to win these voters, but there's a big difference between losing them by 60 points and losing them by 35 points. And when you take into account the Democratic coalition of young people, of people of color, of female voters, and the really, really huge number of votes that we can rack up through them, then as long as we are not getting slaughtered among these non-college whites, then we're able to we're able to do a lot better. So it's not like Biden is going to come out ahead and get 51 or even probably 45% of the non-college white vote, but he's running 10, 15 points ahead of Clinton in these demographics in some states, and that can be really impactful.
Jason, I have a question about people's willingness to be forthcoming in polls. Do you think that there's a chance that there are people who are being polled who say that they're voting for Biden because they don't want to admit that they're actually voting for Trump? And how do polls sort of...
Yeah. So this quote unquote shy Trump voter, shy Republican vote theory has been around for a long time. It's not something that has ever really been borne out in data. And so there are ways that people can do academic studies where they can look and see whether they think that this is a real thing, whether they think that this is a significant phenomenon. And it's not that there's no one that does this. It's just, it has not been reliably proven to be any sort of substantial and repeatable phenomenon that would cause the polls to be systematically biased. It's more, maybe you get the occasional person doing it, but it's not something that has been seen to really be widespread.
Well, that's good to hear.
Captured within the margin of error.
Right. So I guess, is there anything you can tell us about polling from this year? Is Data for Progress doing any polling on this, specifically in the 2020 election, what folks are thinking?
Yeah, so Data for Progress has been polling. We've been releasing a state level polls for Senate and presidential every week. We just released a poll this morning showing Joe Biden ahead by 1 in Texas. That's obviously a state that we're all watching very closely because it would remake the electoral map if Democrats were to win Texas. So if you want to follow Data for Progress on Twitter, we'll be continuing to drop polls on states prior to the election. We should have a couple more coming out this week, and then going into the weekend, we'll have we'll be having our final predictions.
Okay, so you brought up Texas. You've tempted me into this. I'm sorry, I have to ask. Like, Texas is seeing record turnout, which is amazing, and we're very happy about that, and it's really cool. But how does the deluge of turnout this year impact the accuracy of polling, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, obviously polling is, it's more difficult in non-standard years. And this is a non-standard year for any number of reasons, from the record number of vote by mail to the pandemic to just the massive surge in voter turnout. Certainly there are a number of factors to look at, but there is one thing that we know pretty well. And it's not an ironclad law, but it is a very good rule of thumb, which is that Democrats do better when there's higher turnout, particularly in Texas, which is a very young state. It's a very college educated state, and it's a very diverse state. And what we have seen in the past is that you would have an older, whiter demographic that would be continuing to keep Texas red. And this is something that, Beto O'Rourke and a lot of the people in Texas love to say, that Texas isn't a red state, it's a non-voting state. And so this year, I mean, we've already seen Texas surpass 80% of its 2016 vote totals, which is, it's astonishing. I mean, it's really something to look at. So I want to be clear, Texas is not going to be the tipping point state. So Texas will not be the state that determines whether or not Joe Biden wins the election. We should be looking at Pennsylvania for that. We should be looking to maybe North Carolina for that, or Wisconsin, Michigan. But Texas is, by everything we're seeing, in play for this cycle.
Okay, so then if Texas is not the tipping point state, you listed a number of states, several of which are not counting their early votes early. Looking at Pennsylvania, and I think the other one is what, Wisconsin is the other one that doesn't. Anyway, what's your like top line takeaway from the aggregate of all the polls you've done, all the polls you've looked at, like on the presidential election? What's your bottom line take?
I think they're looking great for Joe Biden. Every piece of evidence that we have seen is that things are looking great for Joe Biden. The conventional wisdom after 2016, everyone was very scared after 2016 because people were, confident, I would say overconfident about a Clinton victory. And a lot of that was less borne out in polls and less borne out in the data than it was people just being sure Donald Trump could never win. And so after that happened, then I feel like there's this kind of sense, and I see it in my friends, my family. They're just really since for the past year and a half, I'd be like, no, Donald Trump's a weak incumbent. He has a high disapproval rating. Like, it's quite likely we'll be able to take him out. And they're like, polls were wrong in 2016. He's going to win again. I don't care. And that's a wildly unhelpful mindset to have. So what I would always tell them is look, we can win this election. Facts still matter. Things still matter. And so what we're seeing right now is pointing towards a strong Biden victory. Could we be wrong again? Absolutely. Do I really hope to not having this video, screenshotted and shared back to me by some Trump Twitter troll 2 weeks from now? Absolutely.
Oh,
but we still have to look at the information available to us and have some sort of confidence in it. And the information that we have available to us shows that things are looking really good. And as I tell all of my friends who, being the poll guy, everyone likes to text me, should I be worried? What should I think? And I'm like, look, if you got time to be texting me, you have time to be making calls. So that would be my message to everyone that's concerned about this. Is, just
excellent.
Do whatever you can to get us across the finish line.
If you have time to worry, you have time to be doing something productive. There you go.
Mm-hmm.
correct.
Well, on that note, Jason, thank you so much for joining us. We will see you again quite soon, I'm sure.
All right, fantastic. Thanks.
That didn't actually make me feel, did that make you feel better?
It made me, when we do this show, I have my computer sitting on a wooden tray table, and I've been knocking on it lightly as Jason has been talking, because it didn't quite make me feel better, but I felt the need to do that because I hope it's true. But
yeah.
I mean, listen, we heard from the expert, right? He's the poll guy.
He said that our current position that polls are scary is unhelpful. He said it was unhelpful. That was the word he used. My mindset is unhelpful. It actually is probably really
We got to fix our mindsets then, make them more helpful.
Well, I mean, I think actually our mindsets are healthy because, of course, Jason can be completely right. But Joe Biden needs to do more than just win, because Donald Trump is going to contest the election results no matter what. He's going to try to stop the count of mail-in ballots. These polls are including information about in-person ballots, mail-in ballots, people who are going to mail their ballot in the day before the election. And so I mean, the bottom line is if Jason's prediction is accurate on election day, that's the ball game. But if it takes a couple of weeks of vote counting for his prediction to play out, it's still an extremely stressful headspace to be in.
Right. And we have to be prepared to do everything we can to make sure that all the votes are counted so that his poll prediction can be correct.
Got to keep counting until everybody's votes are counted, as Donnie Fowler said, which seems quite fair in a system where the point is the people vote to make these big choices. Speaking of which, it is 8 days before the end of voting. If you haven't voted yet, do. But also, if you are sitting on a mail-in ballot that you are planning to try and mail, we are now probably in the window of time where you are better off dropping it off if you can. I think the recommendation was 10 days out from the election was the last day anyone should really be mailing a mail-in ballot. So if you're hanging onto your ballot because you just don't want to part with it, you like to hold it, snuggle it, cuddle it, or because filling it out is strangely intimidating after all of the hanging chads of 2000 and it's stressing you out, like overcome that, call a hotline, get some help, fill out your ballot, mail it in. Do it for democracy. That's our show. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Count. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. This is Alana Sivan, and we will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow, we have a really exciting guest you are not going to want to miss. Tomorrow, Representative Pramila Jayapal of Washington State will be here with us to talk about all the things. We will see you tomorrow.